everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Ed Cope and Professor Chris Cushion. Ed and Chris, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
Likewise, thank you, Dan, for the invite and looking forward to it.
Why don't we start by getting you to introduce yourselves to the Sports Psych Show audience. Ed, why don't you go first? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. So currently a lecturer in sport coaching at Loughborough University, where I've been for just over a year or so now. So my kind of main research, teaching interests were around coaching practice and behaviour. So very much kind of located within the coaching pedagogy discipline, if you like. Previous to that, I spent a few years working at the Football Association, where I kind of worked in a learning design role. And it was really there, I guess, that got me interested around some of the stuff that we're maybe going to go on and talk about today. Or I guess I started to see where some of the theoretical stuff that I was reading previous to joining the FA started to kind of come to light, working at the FA, and kind of I've continued that working with Chris at Loughborough around kind of, as I say, the area of coaching behaviour and practice.
Great. And Chris?
Very good, Ed. I'm Chris Cushion. I'm Professor of Coaching and Pedagogy at Loughborough University. I'm going to make everybody feel old. I actually coached my first session as a coach in 1989, the winter of 1989. And looking at my grey beard here, I do definitely look old enough. So been coaching a while. I coached first before returning to higher education. I'm one of these strange people who had other jobs and careers before going back to higher ed. So I've worked at every level in the game in football, so from community schemes, grassroots football, academy and professional clubs. Coached every age group from under 9 up to under 23, not quite made it to a first team, but I've watched a few sessions over the years. Been involved in coaching as an academic since 98. Did my PhD at around 2000 around ethnographic practice in professional youth coaching, and been writing and publishing and watching coaches for 20 plus years, really. So coaching is my interest, and I focus in around coach behaviour, coach learning, coach development. Basically, I'm just a coaching kind of nerd, as it were.
Well, as a sports psychologist who has a fairly broad definition, enjoys a broad definition of sports psychology to incorporate, I'm passionate about skill acquisition and coaching science. I wouldn't suggest I'm an expert in either. I'm really excited to have you both on to talk more about coaching. We've done that quite a bit on the Sports Psych Show before, but what I'm hearing is a real, for both of you, a real rich background in both practice and the academic side of things. And today, you're both here to discuss an article that you wrote, I think, back in 2020, or at least it was released back in 2020, for a journal called Impact, which is a journal of the Chartered College of Teaching. And this article is entitled "A Move Towards Reconceptualising Direct Instruction in Sport Coaching Pedagogy." So, in my simplistic terms, defining or redefining direct instruction within sports coaching. So, do you want to, I don't mind if Ed, Chris, either of you, do you want to give me a bit of background to this article? How did it come about? And then perhaps give us a brief overview as to what it's about.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to go first and then pass over to Chris. So, I mean, this was something that Chris and I had been speaking about for a long time. And as I say, it was housed in our existing research. And of course, Chris's research is more extensive than mine, but this is something that we've both been interested in relative to our kind of academic careers. And I think, there's probably a number of ways to look at this, Dan. There's obviously the advancement of Twitter in the last 5 or 6 years, which I think is changing the landscape of kind of coach learning, maybe to some extent, or certainly where coaches access information from. And so I guess that we were seeing more and more discussions on platforms such as Twitter, which in many ways were kind of binary statements, which I guess we've all made in our time. and on the face of it, intuitively very appealing. But actually, as you start to peel away some of these kind of statements or sayings, you actually kind of think, well, they don't make any sense, and they're not very accurate, and they're probably not very helpful. So there was that kind of side of things, which I guess in some way informed us coming together to think about this. But there was also the kind of the coaching pedagogy literature, which seemed to have reached the point that had become quite binary, had seen direct instruction as a certain thing. And I think it was that certain thing that it was being seen as that we maybe had some questions about. And so alongside that, we were both engaging, and without again speaking on Chris's behalf, but engaging kind of like the educational psychology literature, which again had started to come to the fore. And it's not uncommon in coaching to draw upon other fields. Coaching is very well known for doing that. And so started to read broader than kind of the coaching literature and figure out, well, actually, there's this whole body of research here which supports direct instruction as an approach or as a method that is beneficial for learning under certain circumstances, and we can maybe explore that a little bit later. And so it was reading that work that made me think, okay, this seems like it's actually got some benefit in coaching, and actually I think we can bring this body of work into coaching, and I think it will clarify a number of issues which are currently quite problematic or at the minute are not very clear. So that was the kind of the sentiment for the paper.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, and I guess if I can claim some responsibility here, but when I first started looking at coaches' practice, it was very selfish, and I'm sure, it was just an obsession to watch as many coaches as I could. 20 years ago, I had some foolish ambition that I could actually be a coach of some kind. So I wanted to watch as many coaches as I could, and had incredible access to professional clubs and professional coaches. So did observational research and tend to do systematic observation, i.e. a predefined schedule of coaching behaviour, produce objective data. And my early work is in systematic observation. So my first paper published in 2001 is a SysObs paper, basically. So I observed 14 coaches for a period of time, recorded their behaviour, developed a behavioural profile. So what's really interesting about this body of research is that it started in the 70s, basically. So Tharp and Gallimore observed John Wooden, and then some of their students, Lacey and Darst, and those guys started observing coaches in the US. And what they did, you may have 14 behaviours on initial inventory, a coach behaviour inventory. But what they did is they took feedback, demonstration, instruction, basically a lot of teaching behaviours, and reduced it to instruction. So when you read a lot of these papers, they talk about, the coach's behaviour was predominantly instruction. But if you actually read the paper, you start to see they've collapsed a lot of these behaviours under a broad remit of instruction. Okay. Now, over the years, and I don't know how it's happened, that idea that instruction includes a whole range of behaviours, not just telling people, what to do, that idea is kind of morphed into this idea. So we've thrown out feedback and demonstration and observation, all these things as instruction, and instruction has literally just become telling people. And telling people what to do is now some kind of evil that we should never ever undertake. So there's kind of research background where Ed and I felt that instruction actually has been reduced and narrowed to this very small thing. And even initially in that that research, early research from the 70s and 80s in coaching, didn't reduce instruction in that way. It saw it as a much more broader thing. And again, I guess, we talk about John Wooden, for example. He just talked about doing drills. And I know for some people that, I'm surprised I've not been struck by lightning by even saying that, actually saying a drill. But a drill for John Wooden was everything he did in practice, and it was 1v1 and 2v1 and 3v2s and 2v2s. And everything was a drill. And yet we've come to think of a drill as looking and being a certain way. So over time, these terms have taken on a life of their own in a very reductive way. almost shrunk down to the very minimum, and are now being discussed in that way. And I guess Ed and I wanted to say, well, hang on a minute, let's slow down and think about some of these concepts and kind of bring them back to how they were originally intended and understood, and really for the benefit of coaches and coaching. Really, if we think about these things in a very narrow way, then we tend, that's not helpful in trying to support people's practice and be better coaches.
Yeah, and I think just added to that, before we move on, I see a lot of this around instruction being associated with yelling at kids and like unethical coaching practices. Now, nobody's work that I've read has claimed instruction to be that, and nobody that I know would claim that is in any way appropriate and should ever happen. So instruction is not yelling or shouting at kids from the sidelines, as it has often been conveyed to be. And so I think it's important up front to make it clear that isn't instruction. That's just like, again, without wishing to fall into the binaries, that is bad coach. Like, nobody would claim that there's an evidence base to support that type of approach. And I think this is where, again, there's been an obsession, is that we've got in, and again, maybe the SysObs workers contributed towards this, but we've got into this culture of quantifying and getting into this, this type is better than this, or this, we need to do this more than this. Whereas actually, somewhere along the way, we've lost sense of quality. So if we think about these people, that anybody that advocates a certain approach over something else, let's take that approach and put it on a continuum. And you can have that approach as being done really well, but equally done really, really badly. But yet we don't ever kind of get into the nuances of what good or bad looks like in that approach, or what appropriate or inappropriate looks like. So we can have really bad instruction, like, that does nothing for learning, but equally we can have really high quality instruction which does a lot for learning. Just like we can have really bad questions that are absolutely pointless and do nothing, or certainly don't do the thing that the coach intended it to do. And equally, we can have really like appropriate, effective questioning that's informed by evidence, in terms of, if you ask questions in these ways to these type of learners, then you will get this likelihood happening, whilst it isn't obviously a causal relationship. So we I guess some of this also was trying to move away from, let's stop getting obsessed with frequency, let's stop getting obsessed with type, and let's try and shift the dial a little bit and focus on quality of whatever it is that the coach is doing.
Agreed. And I just think one other point, and yes, we can move on. I think there's also this issue around coach behaviour and practice type and practice design, and we've coupled certain behaviours to certain practice types and practice designs, and I think for me that's false. That's not really, So we've tended to look at this kind of, it's based in behavioural psychology, isn't it? Chop it up into smaller bits, do it as you go along, and reassemble it later. And we've then associated that with a certain type of coaching behaviour, when actually that's, as a coach, I can use a range of behaviours in a range of practice types. It doesn't, these things that aren't mutually, one thing doesn't lead to, so practice type doesn't define behaviour, behaviour doesn't define practice type, is my point. And I think, again, that idea is really hardened, that to coach in a TGFU, teaching gains for understanding way, for example, I can only ever ask questions, because that behaviour fits with that practice design or that practice type. And for me, that's false. That's not, it's not practical. It's not pragmatic, and it's a false thing. It's a pseudo principle, or a false principle that's seen to have grown up.
What I hear from both of you is an element of frustration as academics around coaching, as coach practitioners, as coach developers. You're frustrated because, for some reason, over the years, since the 70s, as you say, Chris, direct instruction has been tarnished and misunderstood. It's been placed in the naughty corner, essentially. And nowadays, there's a wide voice, or a voice that's getting wider and broader, around moving away from direct instruction towards what we might describe as more constructivist forms of coaching. You start this article, which I should say to everybody listening in is free to read. All you got to do is, you guys will be able to give me the exact location, but even if you just Google Impact and Dr. Ed Cope and Professor Chris Cushion, you'll find the article. You start by, we want to keep things light today, but let's not completely ignore the academic side. You start by talking about a binary situation where coaching is finding itself between constructivist informed and direct instruction approaches. And that's where a lot of confusion is arising. Would I be right in saying that, Ed?
I absolutely would say that that's where the confusion lie. I think it is quite interesting. I mean, coming back, just to a previous point around what Chris raised. So if we go back, there was a paper published by Moore and Franks in 1996, and they actually give their take on what instruction is, or from their perspective. And I'd like to read out kind of verbatim. So they write, and for those interested, it's a paper in the Journal of Sports Sciences, and the page number is 523 for this particular quote. But so they write that instruction requires the application of skills that range from the planning and organisation of learning experiences to the presentation of instructional feedback information. They further write that effective instruction involves selecting and orchestrating appropriate behaviour rather than mastering and applying a few generic teaching skills. So I think that really, if you actually look at the literature and if you look at the research, I actually now find it very difficult to determine where the line is drawn between what constitutes constructivism or what constitutes behaviours associated with constructivism versus behaviours that are associated with direct instruction. And I find it really, really difficult to know where the line actually is drawn. So I don't know if that's answered the question. Maybe Chris can give a better response.
Well, yeah, I think for me, I call it a type 1 error. So constructivism is an epistemology. It's a paradigmatic viewpoint. So it makes assumptions about knowledge and reality and the world. And it's not an approach to coaching. It's a set of assumptions. So I think there's a real slippage between, paradigm, epistemology, ontology, the underpinning philosophical ideas and method. And again, type 1 error is paradigm doesn't define method. It really doesn't. So we can, I don't know. So we can, it's how the method is used makes it align or not to a particular paradigm. Okay. So in research, for example, we could use a Likert scale. So one, you rate something 1 to 5. So the assumption is a singular reality, i.e. everybody. So if I hit somebody on the hand with a hammer and they have to grade their pain 1 to 5, everyone's 5 is the same and everyone's 1 is the same. Whereas we know that individuals have different tolerances. Okay. So that a positivist, a singular reality would enable me to take 100 Likert scales and say something about pain. Okay. Now, a constructivist approach says multiple constructive realities, knowledge is subjective, and we have to experience. Okay. So, but method doesn't define paradigm. So off the bat, I can say, well, actually, I can't use a Likert scale under a constructivist paradigm because it assumes a singular reality. However, if I use it intra-individually, so if I just use it with you, Dan, over time, of course I can use a Likert scale because I'm only interested in your reality. So method does not define paradigm does not define method. And I think we've slipped in this idea that constructivism is a set of philosophical assumptions. We've got some methods that we've underpinned that are under that. But we can take a range of methods and consider it under constructivism and positivism. So I think that's why, one of the issues that Ed has is it's not, you can't box things off like this. It's really about how things are used and their intent and all of these other things that make it align or not.
And I think that's a really interesting point relating back to systematic observation as a method in coaching, because the earlier work probably was very much fixed within a positivistic paradigm, because what happened was that these kind of expert elite coaches in the US, such as the John Woodens, were observed coaching, and that was then taken to say, right, John Wooden does this, and therefore that is effective coaching. So if everybody does this, then everybody is an effective coach. That was kind of the sentiment of that earlier work.
I mean, that was a process. It's a process product thing, isn't it? Saying if I behave this way, therefore I'll get these outcomes. There's a process product to it. And again, my early work is the same. I've taken these coaches, I've flattened out context and the players and everything, and described, lumped the coaches together and called them coaches, and said, well, actually, I've ironed out the group, the individuals they're working with, their own coaching, all that nuance and context is ironed out, because I've assumed coaching is a singular thing that I can use and put a lens on, and that there's a certain set of assumptions there, isn't there? And SysObs was definitely used like that initially, whereas now I think we're using it in a much more intra-individual way. So somebody has an individual behavioural profile. We don't compare it necessarily to somebody else, because my coaching is your coaching is, they're all different, and it's about their own individual development. So again, it's method. Paradigm doesn't define method, right? We can use the method, but it's how we use it. Does it align to the paradigm or the assumptions? And I think that's an important thing to remember.
It's interesting what you said there, Ed, about we can study John Wooden and we can make assumptions about his coaching and say, well, that should be how everybody coaches. But what I hear you saying is you can't just box things off, that context matters. Chris, I hear you talk about individual differences. Individual differences matters. Different groups might matter. There isn't one way to do things. Perhaps ideal coaching is more pragmatic, Ed?
Yeah, so I've just written down there, again, it's these associations, and again, that informed the sentiment for the paper, was that what terms are being associated with direct instruction, and one of the terms is coach-centered. So I hear it a lot that a direct instruction approach to coaching is a coach-centered approach. And, as Chris was part of a team of people that wrote a paper in 2014 based on the work of Carl Rogers. And Chris can give more detail in terms of who Carl Rogers is. But ultimately, I guess one of the key, statements that came out of that paper was that, Carl Rogers' work was located in person-centeredness. And I can't remember whether it was something that Chris and the team said, or whether it was something that was a direct quote based on Carl Rogers' work, but it was around person-centeredness is around, or the behaviours associated with person-centeredness are based on meeting the needs of who's in front of you. And so if we take the context and if we take the individual, then ultimately we know that people need different things based on their level of expertise, based on their developmental status, based on their previous experiences. So we can't just box everything off and predetermine what coach or athlete centeredness actually looks like or is. But ironically, by doing that, you are being the opposite to probably what you think you are doing. So I think it's interesting there around, the terms that have been associated, and actually direct instruction is as much person-centered as anything else in certain circumstances and certain situations. So the context is absolutely fundamental, understanding who's in front of you, what do they need and want from you. And then I think that crucial point of, and then do we listen to that, or do we simply hear what they say but not respond to it?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Yeah, I mean, Carl Rogers, I think you'll know Dan as a psychologist, was, I believe, the founder or the father of person-centered therapy, and he wrote a lot about that. And it was, he quite clearly said that you can't define person-centeredness by a set of behaviours. It is about meeting the needs of the person in front of you. And as Ed, quite eloquently said, I do find a rich irony in that coaches are defining what player-centered is and then telling their players they're being player-centered. It's like, oh, hang on a minute. You're defining for them what player-centered is, and then you're uniformly delivering the same thing to everybody. It's like, well, you seem to have lost the essence of being player-centered here a little bit. You're not really thinking about the needs of the people in front of you, or adjusting your behaviours. I mean, ultimately, I think there's a set of things that we can all agree on, that we coach through the game. So we set up a practice environment to bring out things through the game, through the practice. And we, as coaches, we coach in the game. We do things in the game. I don't think there's any group of individuals that would disagree that we do that. How we label it and what that looks like will depend on the people who age and stage, what their needs are, what's appropriate. So how I coach in the game and how I coach through the game will very much depend on the people who are standing in front of me.
And I think this is an important point in kind of trying to, move away from these binary discussions, because ultimately, I guess what we've tried to start a conversation around here is what do we actually understand direct instruction to mean, and what does it actually look like? And so, I would say that pretty much everything a coach does would sit on a direct instruction continuum. So let's take constraints-based coaching. And again, I don't wish to contradict ourselves by comparing like practice design with coaching behavior. But if we were to take constraints-based coaching, which many would say instruction has limited place within that particular practice design, rightly or wrongly, but by its very nature, constraints-based coaching, i.e. putting conditions on games, is a form of instruction. Because what you are doing is you are guiding and supporting athlete learning so that they focus on something more specific. And so if you looked at that from kind of the learning science perspective, then what you're ultimately trying to do is reduce the load on the working memory. You are trying to simplify the complexity and the chaos that is happening, because the athlete cannot deal with all of that, and therefore it's a form of scaffolding. Now, the interesting thing here, and I guess this might come back to your first point, Dan, is that scaffolding, for as long as I've read it, has been very much associated with situated learning, which has been associated with constructivism. But again, like, why? Like, where has this come from? Because if you look at all of the direct instruction work in the educational psychology literature, dating back before sport pedagogues started to talk about this stuff, they talk about scaffolding, and it's one of Rosenshine's principles of instruction, as being a critical part of direct instruction. All of the direct instructionalists, if we want to call them that, at the very center of a direct instruction approach is scaffolding. And so I think sometimes we talk about these things and we're probably more similar than people would want to accept. And if we actually got to the coalface of practice, and we would see these coaches doing these things, it would be really interesting what people would term that as.
Yeah, and I think that's where we kind of get the methodology and the epistemology bit kind of confused, and we kind of straw man it a little bit, don't we? In terms of practical coaching behaviour, I want to connect the learner to the to be learned material. I want to do increasingly complex versions of the whole. I want to provide support, guidance, a whole range of things to the learner to meet their needs. And what there's a lot more similarity than there are differences. I think it's just when we but then if we step away from the method and start talking about the theoretical underpinnings or the ideas of why we think things work, then that's the fork in the road for me. That those underpinning assumptions of why this works. I don't think that anyone, we can whatever terminology, we can manipulate the learner, the task, and the environment, and we can call it constraints and affordances, we can call it conditions, we can call it what the hell we like, but we know that these things are useful to help people learn. And as a coach, I have a huge, and I think it's almost impossible if we took a TGFU approach and a constraints-led approach, and we did an experimental design. We did a randomized controlled trial of one group and another. I think that, both of those things lack such construct validity that you'd never ever get anything. And what I mean by that, construct validity. So if I design a test to measure anaerobic endurance and I take 100 people and 50 of them are marathon runners and 50 of them are 400-meter runners, the tool should separate them into 50 and 50, right? Because it measures anaerobic endurance. Whereas, I think that TGFU and constraint, all these things lack real construct validity. What you actually do is so similar, it'd be virtually impossible. The constructs are lacking. What you'd actually do. I call it a condition, you call it a constraint. I'm manipulating the task, the environment, and the learner. But what I'm doing the same thing as you, essentially, but I'm calling it something else. It's virtually impossible to separate these things out because of that, the construct validity of the concept. And that's great for an academic discussion, but practically on the ground, what am I doing? Increasingly complex versions of the whole. I'm coaching in the game and through the game. I'm manipulating the stuff according to the learner's needs. I'm providing support when they need it. Very pragmatic way of looking at things, I think.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because I think terminology, we can talk about, it's just semantics, but I think we're confusing coaches with it. We are confusing people with it, and that is the problem. And that is an issue that academically we have to confront, and practically we have to confront, because and again, there's an irony, isn't there, in the people that are fundamentally against direct instruction. Yeah, are they not telling people to do a particular thing? So in themselves, they are being instructional in what they are saying the approach should be that coaches should be using, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Grounding this, I'm really interested in this notion of direct instruction being defined broadly. I think people listening in would tune into, okay, well, what is direct instruction? Because there are people in our industry who are saying, we shouldn't necessarily engage in direct instruction. But what I hear you both say is that the definition of direct instruction can be broad, along a continuum. It can involve the task. It can involve cues and clues and triggers. It can involve questions. It can involve an array of behaviours. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. And I think, again, this is another open access article, and something that I would highly recommend anybody going to read is the Barak-Rosenshine paper, which was published in the American Educator in there's two versions, but there was one in 2010 and one in 2012. It's quite a short piece. It's not overly from an accessibility in terms of ability to understand and read it. I think it's very clear and very straightforward. But that's where I'd go to. And Rosenshine, again, is somebody who's been writing about instructional approaches for probably the best part of 40 years now. I think his first paper that I came across, and there might have been something that preceded this, was 1967. So he's been writing about this stuff for a number of years. And, I guess this paper in 2012 is accumulation of the work and the research that's been done in this area. And so he's got these 10 principles of direct instruction, and they include all the things that you've just said there. So reviewing previous learned material, scaffolding, questioning for understanding, checking for understanding, allowing independent practice time, and there's obviously some more. I'm just trying to remember them off the top of my head here as we speak. But again, you look at those, and I'm sure that the more, I guess, discovery based individuals, or those that have that kind of leaning, would probably look at that and say, well, hang on a minute, some of that stuff is what I think discovery or guided discovery learning is. And so, again, it comes back to that point of there's probably greater levels of similarity than there are difference. But But when we start talking about semantics and language, that's where things seem as though they're much further apart than they probably are. And again, we end up with this echo chamber where we just talk beyond each other. I think certainly in an academic sense, and we all engage with practitioners, we all engage with practical coaches, we all have coaches who are out there on a day-to-day basis within our networks, and you speak to them about this stuff and they just can't relate to it. They can't relate to it, and they don't relate to it, and they don't engage in it from my experiences, because they just don't. It's not what they experience on a day-to-day basis.
So even if, guys, we strip away the academic terms, constructivism, these kind of terms that people go, whoa, what on earth does that mean? What you both are saying in this article, and we can do a slightly deeper dive into some of the cognitive stuff you've spoken about and some of the Rosenshine principles to bring that to life. What you're saying is, whoa, look, everybody stop. We've had 20, 30 years of this increasing noise around got to be games-based, got to be games-based, got to be discovery learning, can't interject, let the kids play, let them play, let the players play. And you're saying, and they're saying alongside of that, don't interject with direct instruction. And you're going, well, stop, hang on. This is a range of behaviors, a range of processes and practices, direct instruction. Don't demonize this. Actually, this can be a really pragmatic, useful, individual-specific, context-specific form of coaching that's important for development. Am I grasping what you guys are saying here?
I think so. And I think if when people hopefully get round to reading the paper, they will hopefully get a sense that Chris and I do not argue that this is like the golden ticket or whatever the saying is. We're not saying that coaches should be doing this all of the time, and we don't dismiss all of the other things that coaches should be doing. So, adopting periods of silence, letting the kids get on with it, letting them just play freely. Like, we're not arguing that isn't relevant or that doesn't have a place. That isn't what it is. What we are, saying is that let's put direct instruction back on the table as something that actually coaches can think about in terms of, right, when might this help me help my players learn? Because clearly what we're interpreting and reading at the minute is that, okay, well, let the kids play fine. So what does that actually look like from a coaching? Like, what are coaches doing in those settings? Like, I can never vision or picture when I'm reading this stuff. So what's the coach there for? Like, what's their role? What are they do? What are they actually doing? And if I came to one of your sessions where you said that you are allowing free play or allowing kids to, do all of these different things, like, what would I expect to see you do? And I've never ever got to the bottom of that.
So I want to say something here, and I'd like to get both of your responses. So in my world, where I try to strip everything back for players and coaches and parents without completely abusing the science, right? I often say, and I said it last night to a bunch of people, that coaches tend to be engaged in 3 Ps: participation, so the engagement piece; progression, helping players learn and grow; and then performance, the competitive piece, right? So participation, progression, performance. Do you think if we had a coach online who would be very a little bit, I don't know whether it's skeptical of what you're saying or push back a little bit, I'm just wondering if what they might say is, hey guys, this is very nice, but especially if we're talking about kids, this is about the participation piece here. We're saying let them play and get them involved in games-based activities with little to no direct instruction, in part because we want them to participate. We want them to engage. We want them to enjoy this. And the more that I say as a coach, the less that they're doing. I speak, they're not doing. I want them to just do. I want them to have fun, to enjoy it, to experience running and moving, etc., etc. So I wonder if some coaches might say that to you. And obviously there's also the piece around implicit learning that as kids do, they pick up and they learn implicitly from the tasks that they've from the games that they're playing. And so subsequently I'm better off being hands off and allow them to learn implicitly. I think you've kind of addressed the latter one a bit, but it's more the first one, the participative piece. I wonder if a lot of coaches are going, hey, come on, let's just let them enjoy this.
So my response to that would be that it's probably your practice design that is resulting in the kids not enjoying it. And again, I'm not ever going to disagree that getting kids in like big long lines is the way forward. Like, definitely not. Again, that's not direct instruction, again, as it tentatively has been associated with. So I think it's down to the practice design. And if we look at what actually leads to enjoyment, well, learning leads to enjoyment. So and success leads to enjoyment. And again, we spoke a little bit about this off air before, but I've got a 3.5-year-old who is currently learning to do jigsaw puzzles, and he, like, at the start, there's all these pieces, and he hasn't got a clue where to start. So I'm telling him, right, it needs to look like it does on the box, and there's these pieces here, and he's got a Kindle, and he can play his games there, so he gets some kind of sense of how to do it, because it's a bit, it helps and supports him. And so I've been highly directive with him in terms of, right, this piece needs to go here, and I've manipulated him, I've moved his hand to where the piece needs to go, and I've shown him a number of times this is how it needs to look. And gradually, over the course of the last 2 or 3 months, as we've been doing this more and more, he's now got a reference point to say, right, I understand that the pieces with 2 corners on it need to go in the corner. So then I can figure out, actually, if it's got a hard side, then it needs to go on one of the ends. So he's now figuring that out, and he's now got that. So I'm starting to remove the scaffold a little bit. But if I didn't give him that instruction in the first place, and if I didn't give him that support, then he's not perceiving himself to be successful. And we know perception of competence is really, really important in continuing to do something. So he would have given up before he even got to the point where he can start to work out for himself. So I would question what people's understanding of enjoyment is and what that actually means. Because again, I think people have this sense that it's running around and doing lots of stuff, and kids just doing whatever they want all of the time. But I would, again, question actually what leads to enjoyment, and at what point does learning something, where does that fit with enjoyment? And I would say it's central to enjoyment, because you need to learn something, you need to see yourself having success to want to continue to do it. So that would be my response to that particular point.
Well, we've got 2 points here. So I think the first point is you don't have to be doing something to learn, and activity alone is not sufficient for learning. So you need a mechanism to be connected to the to be learned material, and you need an understanding. So that mechanism could be through the game. So you could put conditions and rules and all sorts of things. So people kind of, I can manipulate the size, the area, the rules. I can manipulate all of these things to help the learner connect to the to be learned material, right? So I can do it through the game. But I can also do it in the game by giving feedback, instruction, demonstration, modeling. So there's a whole range of ways that I can connect the learner to the to be learned material. And there's an important thing as well about understanding. So if we think about evidence-informed principles of learning, want, need, practice, feedback, and understanding. Understanding is a really important part. So learners need to understand, not only what, but why. So why would I do this then? When does this fit? So not only the outcome of this skill, but why do I need to do it? When I don't get it. I need to understand it. I need to reframe it in my own understanding. So it's not good enough for the coach to tell me. It's not really good enough for the coach to show me video. I need to kind of understand it myself. And again, that's the moment when you kind of. So I can remember many years ago. So a bit of a war story here. So I was doing some stuff on academy players, teenage academy boy players. Switching the play. So I manipulate the area to make it short and wide. So I'm starting to condition the area to make the pitch about switching the play, so we can change. So I can change the shape of the area to bring that out. So through the game, I'm showing, okay, so I'm putting different conditions on here. And there's a point where players are receiving the ball, opening out, and I'm using the full width of the pitch here, so that kind of the age. So there's a player receiving the ball, opening his body onto his left foot, which is great. He's predominantly right-footed, but he's looking to play a cross-field pass with his left foot, and his left foot is what he stands on, and it's awful. And that's a coachable moment. So you see him try it a few times. So body shape to receive, everything's right. He just doesn't, and he's now trying to run around the ball and hit it with his right foot. And there's all sorts of problems. So that's an in the game moment. Okay, let's hold it there. What's the problem? And say, I'm really struggling. The pass is on for the body shape, and the pressure means the pass is on with the left foot, but my left foot's bit shaky here, coach. And it's like, okay, well, what do you think we might need? What do you need? What's the solution here? So I probably need to think about hitting the ball with my left foot. So, okay, well, let's stop there. Let's go and do a drill. let's go and do a blocked practice where you receive the ball, open out, and hit some passes with your left foot. So we can look at bilateral learning. Let's look at, with your dominant side, you typically throw the opposite arm away. There's a whole way that you look, when you hit the ball with your dominant foot, and it generally doesn't look the same with the non-dominant side. So we can do some block practice. And the beauty of block practice, yes, it's not great for retention, but it's fabulous for performance accomplishment. And as psychologists, Dan, you know that performance accomplishment is an incredible source of lots of good things, not least confidence and competence. And these are really powerful things. So suddenly you can do some block practice, and then put the person back in the game, and suddenly they feel more confident now to try the challenging pass or to take on the pass with their non-dominant side, because you've met their need. They need to practice this. They've understood why they need to do it, so they own the understanding. It's not me telling them. Now, if I'd have started that session with that individual player and said, right, your left foot's rubbish, we're going to spend 20 minutes banging balls with your left foot, he'd have just looked at me sideways and gone, you've got to be kidding me. There'd have been no interest in. But the way that you've manipulated the practice, the player recognises the need, he understands why he needs that particular skill or technique, and is now asking you to practice it. I'm in coaching heaven here, right? So suddenly the ownership of that practice is over the player, and I'm trying to meet that player's needs. So there's a whole, there's a whole range of things that you can do. So understanding. So in terms of implicit learning, there are some things that are, again, depending on the task and depending on the environment, you probably don't want people thinking too much about it. So you don't want you don't want to draw their attention to it consciously. So you can maybe think about how you give feedback, so how you cue. So you might use external cueing rather than internal cueing, external feedback. Or you might specifically work on a practice where you just manipulate the conditions, constraints, whatever terminology you want to do that kind of replicates that. So you don't interrupt and you don't get that implicitly. So again, for me, it's around the skill of the coach, recognizing, if this is hugely time pressured, if this is something that's going to be engaged under stress, I probably don't want to bring conscious things into it, but I can manipulate the practice design to bring that out. And so implicitly the player's practicing. So again, yes, of course, you want people implicitly learning, but there's a time and a place for it, right? It depends on what the person, on the task, what the person needs, where they are in the development. So there's lots of questions that as a coach we need to think about, rather than uniformly applying, I'm just going to let them play because that's implicit learning. It's like, well, for me, that's kind of misunderstanding what's happening and the principles around learning that we're using.
Just want to add, I think it's probably a good time. One of John Sweller's key concepts around cognitive load theory is this notion of primary and secondary biological knowledge. And again, I think these are important concepts to introduce to coaches or those that are responsible for kind of working with children, because you do hear a lot in terms of let the kids just play, remove your intervention, let them get on with it. And again, I'm not denying that is important at times. But this primary and secondary biological knowledge actually gives us a basis in which to understand some of the things that people talk about and maybe get a bit confused about. So people say, well, they don't need a coach. That kids are skill hungry. They're learning hungry. They can pick stuff up and they just learn it by doing it. And again, if we take this notion of primary and secondary knowledge, John Sweater would say, well, primary knowledge, kids do that because that's the knowledge that kids need to basically survive in the world. So we don't need to teach kids explicitly how to swallow or how to chew food or even how to talk necessarily, although, of course, that there is a method by which we can teach people to talk. But, kids kind of pick it up from being in the environment. And so we've got to be very careful that we don't assume then that putting them in a teaching or learning or coaching environment means that they're going to pick up skills in the same way. Because what John Sweller would refer to skills that you have to learn and knowledge that you have to acquire in kind of coaching and teaching or educational settings, broadly speaking, are what he would refer to as secondary knowledge, i.e. we need somebody to help us learn them. We need we need a teacher, we need a coach, somebody who's informed to help us learn these things. And I think coaching and learning the skills that you need to play, whatever sport it might be, it is that secondary biological knowledge.
What I'm hearing here, especially from you there, Chris, there's your coaching decisions also involve the brains of your players, that there's a time to create tasks and intervene so that you're developing player understanding of the game, that you want to drive mental processing, that there's a greater amount of processing from the individuals who are playing in front of you. There can also be a time where you create a game and the tasks, the constraints enable a player to learn implicitly. So there is less processing, essentially. Processing is always happening, but there's I suppose there's less conscious effort with regard to processing.
So Dan, can I just jump in there? Sorry. So there's two terms which, and again, the constructivist informed approaches. Often what gets associated with constructivism is something called active learning. And again, this is somewhat of a fallacy. So if you break down active learning, actually, there's a suggestion that there's two kind of main forms of active learning. So there's being cognitively active and there's being behaviorally active. So cognitively active is what Chris alluded to in terms of the thinking about what you're doing, engaging in the metacognition. So that's associated with the workings of the information processing system. Behaviorally active is the extent to which you are actually involved in doing something. And it requires both for something to be considered active learning. So we need to be kind of clear that we don't confuse the two, and it's the combination of the two that's actually required.
That's really interesting. And would I be correct in suggesting that, Chris, you mentioned blocked practice, individual practice, isolated practice, if you like, where we've stripped back the information from the environment? And as you, in your example, we're just, let's say, kicking a ball at goal with our left foot or whatever it might be. That affords us the opportunity to turn up the volume of being cognitively active alongside behaviorally active. We can really immerse ourselves in that task. Really think about it.
I think the key for me is advancing understanding and skill together, and not prioritizing one or the other. So, there's and this is not direct instruction, right? So there's a way of that you do unopposed block practice first, and you progressively make it more difficult, and you finish with the context or the game at the end. I mean, that's a very traditional way, and it's a way that I went through the FA, the FA Coaching Awards. That's the structure of session. That's a very ingrained, essentially behaviorally based. The underlying thing is kind of reinforcement and all that's kind of the underpinning of that, and that so-called traditional way of doing things. I mean, there's a huge echo of that still, in coaching. There's still an echo of it, and you can understand why different approaches rally against it. I mean, the issue with that, of course, is around the understanding. Is understanding why, and again, Broadthorpe and Bunker's idea was their frustration of transferability, i.e., we're drilling the crap out of people here. They can do the technique, but they can't make decisions. They looked at tennis and badminton and a whole range of sports, and part of their frustration was that whether implicitly or explicitly made the connection around understanding. People don't understand, and I think Professor Mark Williams makes a great analogy around golf, you learn to hit each of the clubs, but you don't learn how to play a round of golf, right? So that approach is very much learning this thing isolated and somehow making the connections later. Whereas I would certainly advocate, and the evidence, it's all evidence informed, would advocate that you progress these two things together, so you get that understanding. People know what to do and when to do it, so they have the skill and the understanding together. So that's, for me, a really important part. So, I'm not throwing the isolated and blocked practice out with the bathwater. We understand its limitations. It doesn't give you understanding necessarily unless the understanding is already there. So if I'm working in a performance environment, I can probably do a block type practice with somebody because they understand, they have a picture, they understand where it fits. But with less experienced learners, they probably don't understand where it fits. So we need to give that to them. They need that understanding. They need to understand where this fits, and they need to take ownership for that learning and recognise that actually that meta cognitive thing. I recognise I don't understand this. I recognise I'm not very good at this. That also assumes some level of knowledge and understanding, right? You need to know that you're not very good, so you need to understand what good might look like, or a version. Again, not that there's a singular, unique version of this, but you need to have some sense of, to recognise that this is a weakness, or I need to practice this, or this doesn't work for me. You need to kind of get a feeling for that. So that needs to, you need to be behaviourally active, but also need to be cognitively active to recognise that fact in the first place. So this is the problem around kind of those blocked, isolated practices. It's not necessarily that they're bad, it's how that they are used. I know that they're really poor for learning. They're great for performance, they're great for confidence, and they're great for competence. So if I know that, I can insert them in an appropriate way. So this person understands that they need this, they understand why they need it, and they recognise that that's a thing that they need to work on. Great, let's block it, let's do it. And it, block practice makes you feel good. It makes you feel like, I've got this, I can master it. And that confidence then goes back into a situation whereas before, if you didn't have that, if the game is the teacher and you're not confident in trying the thing that you're weak at, when do you ever get to practice it? My own research, working with in my PhD, talking to players, actively hiding their weaknesses and weren't practicing. That I know I'm rubbish at this, so I never ever practice it, because the people who are making decisions about me will see that I'm not very good at it, and that's a weakness, and I want to portray strength. So there's a whole the cultural dynamic about psychological safety and being able to portray your weaknesses. In some sporting environments, you're not able to do that. You have to hide your weaknesses, and you can't, So if the coach is putting on a game designed to develop this, but I'm determined as an individual to hide the fact that I can't do it, I'm never going to practice it. and I'm never going to get better at it. And so we're in this, we're in this cycle of it happening. So, so it needs to be a bit more personalised. It needs to have a little bit more understanding to it for me.
I'm imagining various people listening to that, and what's ringing in my ears, because you've mentioned, Chris, and I agree with you, that isolated practice can help build competence and confidence. I wonder if some people might say, yes, but it's isolated, so it's building a false sense of confidence, that it's not a confidence related to the game.
Well, Dan, can I jump in? I mean, so I understand that argument, but I'll come back to one of my previous points in that there might not be a continuation to want to do it unless you are building that in the first place. So there has to, it's the two things don't always perfectly align, but if you want to keep people engaged and sustained, then they have to see that they're gaining some success, right? So if they're not seeing that they're gaining that success, then they're probably not going to want to continue and put themselves in a situation where they think they're absolutely hopeless. And listen, we all probably know people that we've either played various sports with in the past where they've given up. I mean, you look at it in golf as an example. Golf uses a handicap system as a means by which to give people a sense of, oh, I'm still getting success, or I'm still being able to be competitive against somebody who's way better than me, because the handicap system kind of evens the playing field to some extent. And so we have to think about what's the equivalent of that in other sports, and how can we ensure that people still think that they are achieving success and are feeling as though they are getting some recognition of competence, so that they want to continue, so that we can actually put them in the situations where, that reflect something that looks like the real version of the game. I don't think we get to that point unless people think they have some element of competence.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I've sat in meetings before, and a colleague of mine has asked what job description has it got on your passport, and the person has said coach, and the irony's not been wasted on everyone in the room when they're not, they're talking and stuff like a coach. So this doesn't happen in one session. This doesn't happen instantaneously. So the evidence is as tall as me, and I'm pretty tall, that block practice improves performance.
Yep.
Right, and performance accomplishment, as you know, Dan, is a source for many positive psychological traits. Right, performance accomplishment. Right. But at the same time, task engagement, it can't be too easy or too difficult, right? So we've got an issue around task engagement. So if stuff's too easy, it's meaningful. And if it's too difficult, people aren't prepared to risk it. So we've got an issue there. So for my example, so I've got somebody who is a central midfielder who wants to be able to have an option of using their non-dominant foot on a big, long raking 60, 70-yard ball, drop it on a sixpence, all of that kind of thing. They can do it on one side, they can't, but to do it with their right foot means they have to, all sorts of things are happening. So they recognize the need. I need to develop my left foot, right? So we can put some blocked practice in where they can work on it, but we put them back into that same condition game. They don't run out, we don't ever, they're not then dropped straight into competition, into the heat of competition, into the test. We're still back in training and we're still in practice. And as a coach, I can watch that player now. When that player receives in a position to where are they trying it? If not, why not? I noticed you received the ball there. You didn't really. Oh, I still don't feel. Okay, fine. And that's a coachable moment. We can freeze frame, rewind it. Go on, have a go, and praise it and make it psychologically safe and all those sorts of things. So we can support that learning, so that the confidence they have from performing the skill is transferred into that more competitive environment, and we can do it over time, and then it appears in the test, i.e. in competition. So again, this very linear, it's going to happen instantaneously idea, I think is not the correct one. So it's how we use these things and recognize that this is a process, and how we support our players. Basically.
So I don't want to hijack this in terms of taking it too much in the direction of isolated practice, but I actually think I'm going to draw a relationship with direct instruction and what you guys are saying in the article. I'm going to try to. You guys can come back at me and go yay or nay, but because this interests me, because I know this is a big bugbear of a lot of coaches, that isolated practice, block practice, however you want to call it, taking a player out of a team and doing stuff is perhaps not seen as a waste of time, but maybe suboptimal. And I questioned that. And I love your idea of cognitively active and behaviorally active, because I just wonder sometimes if isolated practice, we as coaches engage a player in being behaviorally active, but not cognitively active enough. If I, Ed, you use golf as an example, and I was a pro golfer, so I have some experience of golf. And if I reflect back and I think about you're always isolated in golf, but when you're isolating moves and you're doing a drill, I reflect back and I think those drills I engaged in, I didn't engage in them in an optimal way. I was just doing, and I wasn't thinking and doing. I wasn't cognitively doing it as well as behaviorally doing it. And I wonder sometimes let's take soccer, football, as you're describing there, Chris, if this is a coach thing, this is a coach behavior thing, that we have these array of tools as coaches that could be on this continuum of direct instruction. And if we're there with the athlete who's doing this, you want them to be better pass of the ball, crossfield ball, 40-yard ball with their left foot. It's us as coaches by them engaging in direct instruction, which can incorporate cues and clues and questions and hints and tips and how to and all kinds of manner of things. That really gets people cognitively active, and so the learning takes place there. The self-efficacy builds. It's not a waste of time. Actually, it's a very important period of time that builds competence and confidence through direct instruction. No question there, guys, but just a thought, because I was kind of stripping it back to what I was doing in golf, and I just did the drill rather than think the drill. It almost makes me think of Ericsson's deliberate practice, essentially, in some respects. So again, no question. Ed, I don't know if you want to jump in with some thoughts.
I think that's a good point. For me, it's about how it's used, Dan. It's how these things are you. What as a coach am I trying to get from this, and how am I using it? And if I understand, how and why I'm using it. So spacing, is a really good learning principle. So you can do block practice, but again, the evidence says if you space it and have some time, but what am I doing in that spacing time? Am I engaging in a metacognitive process? Am I starting to think about, I can get the learner to be, I can make the practice random, i.e. they can practice this block but then do something else, or I can have that element of spacing. So I do an X number of repetition of something, and then I pause and before I start again. But what's the learner doing in that pause? What am I asking them to think about? How am I engaging them in terms of that practice? So again, it's, and for me, this stuff isn't, a lot of these things are conceptualized as end on end. But for me, when I'm thinking about I'm layering my coaching sessions. Yep. These are layers, kind of mesh that I'm going, so it's the practice starts with a version of something that looks as much like the game as I can physically get away with, bearing in mind the state of the learners. It's specific, it's realistic, it's all the rest of it. I'm coaching through the game. I'm manipulating conditions. I'm putting on rules to bring out the thing that I want to focus on. I'm now looking at this as a coach and trying to understand what's happening with individual players. Is it a common thing? Is there something I need to work? And there's just layers of stuff going on. When do I bring in, do I need to block practice this or not? Or is this fine? Or can I, so there's lots of layering of stuff going on. So for me, all of this stuff is on the table to kind of layer They're all things that I can use to layer my coaching session. It's not an end on end. I do this and then I do that and then I do this, and it's in some unconnected fashion. For me, that's just not how it works. There's some, as Ed and I talk about, there are some, really sound evidence-informed principles that we can layer in our sessions to meet the needs of our athletes. So I'm not thinking about, right, I'm going to do a block practice and then I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do that, and it's just an end-on-end type thing. This environment we're building layers of a learning environment, of which all of these things are tools and resources for us to use if we understand why we're using them and if we understand what we get from them. And I suspect there isn't perhaps enough of that for me.
Yeah, I would completely, concur with that. And I think that's where the issues maybe lie at the minute in terms of, as coaches, as coach educators, coach developers, is enough time being spent helping coaches understand, like, what do their players and athletes need under certain situations and circumstances, and do they understand the benefits and drawbacks of certain approaches? Because I use this quote a lot, and it was a quote by Dylan William, who's a teacher educator, and he talks about everything works somewhere and nothing works everywhere. Now, as a statement in itself, it's clearly not that helpful. But if we start to dig down a bit deeper and start to take that as a principle, then actually I think we can start to recognise, okay, well, what are the intentions of the coach? Why are those their intentions based on what the athlete needs and wants? And then we can maybe start to figure out, okay, well, what is it that we need to try and do here? And what do our athletes need from us? And I think, Chris is right in terms of how can we push the boundaries to get away with what is as representative as possible, but not above that kind of threshold that it becomes too difficult, and equally not below the threshold that it becomes boring and too easy. And so these are all principles that I think are much more helpful for coaches to take with them into sessions, individual sessions, but programs of sessions over a period of time, as thinking tools to say, right, okay, at the point that it becomes too easy, how am I going to change it? How am I going to manipulate something to make it more challenging? Equally, when it's too hard, how do I kind of bring it back? And, we could talk about contextual interference and stuff like that as being, again, useful principles in which to do it. Because, again, we talk about block practice, perhaps, and I say we, I mean like the global we, as though it's always, this vision I think people have is that kids are studying two lines and they're just passing the ball back and forth to each other. And it's like, that's not what, that isn't the vision I have. I have the players receiving the ball in different ways. They're having to take it on their left and their right foot. If we're coming back to a football example, in golf terms, it might be that, they can't hit the same shot twice. So they're in the driving range, but they're having to go for target. So they're having to use different clubs and think about, right, what club to hit this yardage. So it isn't a case of just getting the driver out and smashing 100 balls with the driver as far as you can. So I think we have to be a bit more sophisticated and say that actually we can have very random blocked practice. As I say, the ball is received, it comes in different directions, in different ways. We're just manipulating the environment to make it relevant and appropriate to the intentions of what's to be learned, and as Chris alluded to earlier, helping the athlete or the learner connect with the to be learned information.
Okay, so look, I'm conscious of both your times. I'm also conscious of the learning of the audience, and I'd love to get you back on to talk more about John Sweller's work with cognitive architecture and Rosenshine's work. I think those go hand in hand very nicely, and I wonder if that's a different podcast episode, which will if you'll allow me to invite you back on, we'll get you back on to talk about. I suppose I've got one more slight pushback for you both, because I know, again, some people will be thinking this in their mind. You're both alluding a lot to teacher stuff, essentially, the classroom stuff. And I wonder if there's going to be quite a few people listening in and going, yeah, that's very nice, but this is about motor skill. This is about action. This is about movement. We're not in the classroom here. We're on the pitch, the court, the course. This isn't about being a teacher. This is about being a coach with sport. You can't bring that teacher speak out here. What's your what's your thoughts on that? Either of you, both of you.
Go on, Ed. You can start.
Again, I think I in part understand that argument. I mean, let's be frank about this. There is an absence of evidence simply because of the maturity of the field of coaching in relation to the teaching profession. So I think to begin with, but absence of evidence doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, if that makes sense. We just need to start running studies that best capture, albeit that's incredibly difficult because of the number of variables that are at play at once, to actually be able to determine that a single approach works better than another. But I don't think anybody on this podcast is arguing for that. I mean, what I would say is that there is learning principles, and the principles that we are drawing upon are around how people learn stuff. So regardless of the context, we can't really dispute those too much. So I know we haven't got into it massively today, but if we were to talk more about kind of how our working and long-term memory works, then whether it's in a practical motor skill context, such as, playing an invasion game, or whether it's learning to do math in the classroom, ultimately we have to think about and recognize that our working memory has a certain capacity. We can overload that working memory very quickly by the chaos of the environment. So at a principal level, we need to think about how do we scaffold, how do we offer guidance, how do we offer support so that working memory does not become overburdened or overloaded to the point that we can't possibly take in any information. We also know that information can only be considered to be learned once it's in the long-term memory. So as coaches, we need to be thinking about how do we take, or how do we support our athletes in transferring information from the working memory, where it stays for a very limited period of time and where we can only hold a certain amount of information, to the long-term memory, so that when we are practicing these complex motor skills, we are not having to consciously think about them all the time, which we know just simply wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work. We wouldn't have any kind of level of performance if that's the case, because all that would happen is that people are so consciously engaged in thinking about what they've got to do that by the time they've thought about it, the time has gone and they've missed whatever it is that they needed to do, or the ball's been taken off them, or whatever it might be. So again, I don't know if I've answered that question, but that would be my response to the people that might say that.
I think, it's I can't be a hypocrite and talk about the importance of context and then ignore the importance of context. I think it's, I think that those are reasonable questions to ask. But when you're talking about decades of research, and when you're talking about, we don't have enough research in coaching to do meta-analysis, i.e. the analysis around the findings, that, the type of research. But when you look at some of these principles and the duration, depth and volume of research, the meta-analysis, the fact that these principles are established again and again and again, I mean, you'd be foolish to say, well, it doesn't apply to us. I mean, you'd just be, it's still, as Ed said, it's still about learning. Now, it might be about learning different things in a different context. To dismiss this work out of hand is just it's crazy. So we might say, okay, so there are some, let's test them in our environment, and see if they cross over. Let's not forget that, skill acquisition in sport has a 40, 50 year longer history. I think the first studies around latent learning are 100 years old, around this stuff around performance and learning. So there's a huge history, and some of the principles that we're alluding to, around random and variable practice and the difference between performance and learning are pretty well established in sport, and around feedback and cueing, all of this stuff. There is research evidence from within sport. Some of the educational stuff less so, but to ignore it because it's not in sport, I just think I don't know. It feels like some kind of bias to me. I'm not sure which one it is, but it feels like that to me. When you've got, as I say, decades of research and mountains of this research saying this principle is connected to learning, for us to then ignore it and say, well, it's from education, so it's not relevant. I mean, it's nonsensical for me, Dan, I'm afraid.
Yeah, look, I think, my final comment here, and maybe, you will both make a final comment to close things. I think what, reading your article, and through my own experience of listening to pracademics, if I can use that term, practitioners who are really into. No, I'm not allowed to use that. Professor Chris Cushion is just shaking his head. Pracademic. Some people love it. Some people hate it. It's
definitely a Marmite phrase.
Marmite phrase. Okay, we'll strip that. We'll cut that. I just think what you're doing is you're asking people to stop and think, and have a look at the research evidence, and if people's inclination is to go to the extreme point of view, for example, everything has to be games based, or everything has to be discovery learning, or and as a psychologist, I would say that's kind of within our human nature, is to be a little bit all or nothing, or a bit black and white. Stop, think about this, do a little bit more study, have a think about this, look at, as I say, the research literature. What's the alternative viewpoint? I think I understand why people come in from an extreme viewpoint perspective, because they dislike certain practices or processes or approaches. But in context really matters. Individual differences really matter. And I think the more tools that we have, in my opinion, the more tools that we have in our toolbox, some of those tools are going to be distinctly suboptimal for certain contexts and for certain individuals. But that doesn't mean that we disregard those tools. It doesn't mean they're not going to be effective in other contexts and with other individuals. So that's kind of what I hear from you guys, is just stop and think, and let's think about what the science is saying, and let's think what the implication for practice is, and how can we be more diverse or divergent in our thinking here rather than inflexible.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, I have a more sociological than psychological background, and my work, I have certain assumptions about the world when I write in those terms, but I can't ignore the evidence. I can't, I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this stuff. So there are things that the evidence is incredibly convincing, and I just think that you just need to, you do, as you say, Dan, it's that stop and think and have an open mind. There is no evidence that supports a singular approach to any of this. There is no, and the what's best research is, equivocal. TGFU went through this, which is best kind of thing, and sometimes it's this and sometimes it's that. So I think that's the wrong road to go down. Trying to prove my dad's bigger than your dad kind of thing probably isn't the type of research. I mean, what's more interesting is what works for the learner, what works for the group of people in front of you, and why might there be variability. That's a more interesting question for me. And just having all of this stuff on the table, I mean, it's professional de-skilling, isn't it? In one sense, if you start excluding a whole range of things because it doesn't fit with a particular view, it's almost it's a level of professional de-skilling for me. You're just taking stuff off the table because it doesn't particularly align. Well, there are things that don't align with my worldview, but as a coach, I would still use them and still think about using them when they were, an appropriate moment, because the evidence informs that it does, and experience shows that it works as well. So I think you're absolutely right. That kind of just pause. I mean, what we don't want to do is just keep switching dogma. We go from, we don't want to go from one set of dogmatic rules about learning to another set of dogmatic rules. And I'm sure Ed and I certainly don't want to switch from one dogma to another, and say, well, I forget this and start thinking about that. It's like, well, how does all of this help us work with players, work with athletes to develop and improve their learning, really? So for me, it's all on the table, and for me, it's a meaningful separation of the method and the philosophy. So we can get into the philosophical underpinnings and the underlying theory and the why. Why does it work? Well, that's great, and yes, it is important, but that's a separate discussion from the method. And when push comes to shove, a lot of there are more similarities in method than perhaps we'd care to admit. About making practice realistic, as we use the term representative, if that's the terminology you want to use, but realistic practices, be quality of intervention by the coach, manipulating the environment to bring out the learning in and through, all of those things. There's a huge amount of similarity, regardless of what the label you put on it is.
And before we come on to you there, Ed, just coming back at you there, Chris, I was just thinking of the importance of and also rather than either or. And also rather than either or, because you'll see things more from a sociological lens, as you said, rather than psychological, and I'd be the reverse. But at the same time, I have to appreciate that. I mean, a lot of coaches in certain domains will talk about environment. It's everything. I'm an environmentalist. It's about the environment. So the environment is stunningly important. I as a psychologist, I could never deny that. If I work from a biopsychosocial template, so important. Perhaps many times that is the predominant impact on behavior. That has the biggest impact on behavior. That's not to suggest that individuals won't have different interpretations of the environment, and so subsequently we also have to consider the psychology of response to the environment as well. So it's either it's and also rather than either or. Ed, complete our podcast today, mate.
Okay, thanks.
No pressure.
I think just following on from what Chris said, if we come back to the article and maybe the work that we're kind of currently engaging in, I would hate to think that people interpret us as direct instructionalists, or maybe I don't want to speak on behalf of Chris, but I think he'd probably say the same or feel the same. So jump in, Chris, if you see it differently. But because I don't think we are that. What we are is, as Chris alluded to, we are putting something back on the table that seems to have been taken off the table for a long time, and trying to clarify exactly what it is that we are putting back on the table for coaches to consider, along with all the other stuff that gets spoken and written about. And so I think it's trying to fight the good fight of challenging binary statements and binary discussions and conclusions that happen. I'm writing stuff and I'm researching about stuff at the minute that some might argue is the opposite to direct instruction, and so they might look at it and say, well, where do you actually fit with this then? What do you actually believe? Because on the one hand you're writing about this, and on the one hand you're writing about something else. But as Chris alluded to, this isn't either or, as you alluded to, Dan. It's not either or. This is about trying to understand, okay, well, I'm looking at this through this lens and through this perspective, and trying to help coaches understand why this might be relevant and under what circumstances it might be relevant to adopt this approach. So that's kind of where I'm trying to come from with this stuff. And again, as we said in the paper, and hopefully as it's been interpreted, we're not saying that direct instruction is to be used all the time under all circumstances. That isn't what we've said. We've said that nowhere. We are saying that it has benefits like every other approach has. And for us, it's about moving the dial and changing the narrative of the discussions in coaching to help coaches and to engage in discussions with coaches to figure out what their intentions are and how those intentions match up what the needs and wants of the athlete are.
Yeah, absolutely, Ed. And I think this I think from me, I'm not. I'm a coach actually. That's what I am, and want to have as much available. And I think it's a frustration where, as we started, really, how direct instruction has been reduced to a particular thing, and is therefore dismissed as this thing. And it's like, well, hang on a minute, that's never what it was intended to be. And that's, if you look, if you lift your head and look, there's a much broader definition of this, which is actually incredibly useful for us as coaches if we understand it. And ultimately, it's trying to get to, it's trying to get coaches to understand that there isn't necessarily things aren't bad in and of themselves. It's how and when they're used might be the problem rather than the thing itself.
Good stuff, guys. Really appreciate your time today and trying to demystify what is quite a complex topic and is quite an emotive topic as well for coaches who are passionate about what they do. And I know you would have tapped the interest of the listener. So I think, how can people follow you? I know you're both on social media. You're both at least on Twitter. If you can tell us your handles, if you know them off by heart, and how can people read this article?
Well, yeah, I'm at Coach C1, which is totally unoriginal, and I just did it in 2009 or something like that, thinking, what's this Twitter thing? This will never get used, so I should get around to making it a more meaningful handle and actually relevant. But I'm at Coach C1 on Twitter.
I guess that's implying then that mine probably isn't very meaningful either, because I'm at EdCoach1. So I maybe need to look at that as well. But that's what it is. And then the paper, as you alluded to, simply going on Google, Dan, just typing in direct instruction, Cope and Cushion, I think gets the job done and is an open access, free to read. And it should only take probably 10 minutes to read the article. So it's not a particularly long piece. It's only 4 or 5 pages. So not too cumbersome, which, the intention was to start discussions. It wasn't to provide answers per se. So that's where the article can be found.
Perfect. Gents, thank you so much for your time.
Brilliant.
Pleasure.
Dan, thanks for the platform. Great.
Well, everybody, wasn't that a brilliant podcast? I really enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Site Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.